Hi, I'm Professor Green, and we'll be going through Chapter 4, Business in a Globalized World. One of my favorite chapters. Let's go ahead and get started. So there are 6 major learning objectives here, and before I start with those, I wanted to just highlight a little bit about the case study that we'll be studying along with this chapter. It talks about Intel and the conflict-free products. So the case goes to say that this product, tantalum, comes from this other product, coltan, and it's used to regulate our electricity in our devices, our phones, and different small electronics. Most of this product is obtained in Africa, as well as Australia, Brazil, Canada, but mostly in Africa. And so the issue is that when people are obtaining this, they're often under armed militia governments that will sometimes loot that coltan, and then the profits from the coltan are used to fund those operations. So there's killing, sexual assault, labor abuses in these countries. Congo is the biggest country that is a provider and having this armed militia. And in the 2000, a lot of organizations started to get involved. The electronics industry, as we'll see in the class, we'll watch a video about Intel and how they're involved. The UN got involved, different governments, as well as human rights organizations, the biggest one being the Enough Project. So what happened was that companies like Intel have such a long supply chain, so they couldn't really see exactly whether their products were coming from a conflict-free provider or not. So the regulation came into play. We'll talk a little bit about the Dodd-Frank bill that Obama signed into place that helped protect these workers, protect these circumstances, and all the money going to the armed militia. And now Intel, what they do is they call it bagged and tagged. So they have the products that are mined in conflict-free areas. They bag them and they tag them so that they know as they come out on the other end of the supply chain that these are truly products that they want to be using in their own products. So we'll be talking about that in class, but I just kind of wanted to summarize it for you so you have it in the back of your mind as we go through this chapter. And we'll start with these objectives here. So the first objective is defining globalization and classifying the major ways in which companies enter the global marketplace. So what is globalization? The next one is identifying the international financial and trade institutions that have shaped the globalization process in recent decades, the IMF, WTO, etc. Then we'll look into analyzing the benefits and costs of the globalization business. They're not just all benefits, right? There are also a lot of costs that come with globalization. We'll be identifying the major types of political and economic systems in which companies operate across the world, and then understanding global inequities of wealth and income and analyzing the special challenges of serving those at the bottom of the pyramid. This goes back to that 1% that we've been hearing about for the past decade, and how majority of the world's wealth sits with just a small amount of people. And then the last key objective here is assessing how businesses can work collaboratively with governments and the civil sector to address global social issues. Great. And so workers' rights is one of my favorite social issues. Let's go ahead and jump into it. What is globalization? So this is the increasing movement of goods, services, and capital across national borders. It's a process, right? It's not just a one-time thing. It's an ongoing series of interrelated events. International trade and financial flows that integrate out to the world economy, leading to the spread of technology, culture, politics. Globalization is not simply a trend or a fad, but rather an international system. So if you're not familiar with globalization already, you will be. I assume most of you have already taken international business, and even in your typical financial accounting or finance classes, marketing classes, globalization comes up time and time again because each country is so intertwined. And that a key thing here is that, the flow of products and movement of goods and services, it influences politics, environment, and economies of every nation in the world. And it includes businesses of all sizes. So just because maybe you're going into a family business, you think you won't be affected by globalization, You will. Let's talk about how that comes together. Here we talk about entering and competing in the global marketplace. There are three different parts to this piece. The first one is developing global market channels. First, we build a successful business in the home country, and then we export the products or services to buyers in other countries. We could go on and on with this list that you're familiar with, right? Nestle is a Swiss company. Now we can eat the Nestle chocolate here in the US. PayPal is an American company, and they do a lot of foreign exchange with all different countries around the world, et cetera, et cetera. BMW, right? They're German, they sell cars in the US. The next piece, another option for globalization is to establish global operations. So this is locating plants or services operations in other countries as a way to cut costs. So here BMW comes up again, right? So they not only, BMW not only sells cars in other countries, like we talked about in the first point, but they also produce and manufacture cars in other countries. So Brazil, even the US, they do a lot of manufacturing here. So those are just two different ways to have an organization go global. And then the third way is your supplier. This is purchasing raw materials, components, or other supplies from sellers in other countries. And this work could also be subcontracted. So, for example, Nike is looking for shoelaces in a particular country. Maybe one person is going to supply the cotton, let's say, and one person is going to supply the plastic as a subcontractor. So the gap, obviously, these companies are mostly based in Asia, where they can get really cheap labor to put together the clothing that they then sell in the United States and around the world. And so entering and competing in the global marketplace, this is summarized in three main points: sell, make, source. Sell is where your clients are, who you're selling to. Making is where you're manufacturing things. And then your source, where you're getting your supplies. All opportunities for globalization. Multinational enterprises, MNEs. So many of you will work for a multinational. All of you have bought something from a multinational. This MNEs are defined by the United Nations as firms that control assets abroad. Most global commerce is carried out by only a small number of powerful firms. It probably makes a lot of sense. This list on the next page are the world's top 10 non-financial multinational enterprises. And what they mean by non-financial is that they're not banks, because banks are quite large as well. But this is any product beside a bank. So you'll see that Royal Dutch Shell, based in the UK, they're an oil company, and their foreign assets are around 349,000 million. So, or 349 trillion, I should say. So as you can see, huge numbers here of how big those multinationals potentially can get. This is just the top 100, and so you might be, the top 10. And so you might be thinking, like, where's Google and Facebook? Because they're quite big. Yes, they are big. They're on the top 100, but just not on the top 10. So let's go ahead and move into the next slide. Foreign direct investment. What is this? This is another important aspect of globalization. It's the worldwide flow of capital, the worldwide flow of cash, I guess you could say. The foreign direct investment occurs when a company, individual, or fund invests money in another country, for example, by buying shares of stock in or loaning money to a foreign firm. In 2016, the amount of foreign direct investment in the world was 1.75 trillion. So as you can see, there's a lot of money being invested across borders. And who is investing? Well, many of us. I have, a fund that I get managed out of Europe, yes, but small potatoes compared to the biggest investors are this new trend, they're called sovereign wealth funds. And so these are countries that have money that they take in from taxes and things like that. They have extra cash, that they need a place to invest. So they have billions of dollars that they're looking to invest abroad. And the biggest investors are mostly come again from those oil companies. So Norway, Saudi Arabia, etc. And then inversion, this is something very different. This is where companies avoid taxes in their home countries. So by merging with companies located in other countries and shifting their headquarters there, it's a strategy of acquiring or merging with a foreign firm in order to reduce corporate tax obligations at home. So Burger King did this. They merged with a company in Canada, and then they said that Canada would be their home headquarters because Canada has much lower corporate taxes. It is what it is, I guess. But as the book says, in 2018, when Trump was elected, he was hoping to keep American firms in America. And so for that reason, he reduced the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. And so when the book was written in 2018, they were thinking that there'd be a whole lot less inversion. And from what I've heard and researched, that has been true. So now let's talk about the three major international financial and trade institutions. These are the institutions that set the rules by which international commerce is transacted, right? Because there have to be some rules as to who's investing, how they're investing, what they're investing on. No business can operate across national boundaries without complying with rules set by the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and then many businesses in developing countries are dependent on World Bank and IMF loans to survive. So this is a big and super interesting section. If you think in the last 6 months or so, a year, the country of Greece has done really well. They have opened their borders really early during the pandemic. And if you studied a little bit of Greek history in the last few decades, their economy was not doing well. They just couldn't balance their budget. They had a whole lot of debt. They just couldn't find a way out of that cycle of paying off that debt, managing their government properly. And so that's one of the countries to think about as we go through and we talk about these financial institutions. The first one, though, the World Bank, this actually invests a lot in Africa. Yes, they invest in Greece and in Turkey and things into the Middle East, but they also invest quite a bit in Africa. So let's talk about who they are. The World Bank is established right after World War II in 1944. It provides economic development loans to its member nations. Funds are usually mainly used for roads, dams, power plants, and other infrastructure projects, as well as for education, health, and social services. Food and nutrition courses. That's a big one coming out of the World Bank for countries in Africa, for mothers who are trying to feed their children. The funding is provided by member countries and international capital markets. And so in 2016, the World Bank had about $61 trillion going out in loans around the world. So that's a lot of money, right? If you've ever been to Washington, D.C., it's right downtown, huge bank right across the street from the IMF, which we'll talk about in a moment, the International Monetary Fund. But as for the World Bank, these countries have voting power based on the size of their economies, as I mentioned. And so obviously, the US is the biggest. The US has a lot of influence when it comes to the World Bank. One of my friends from business school, her dad, he was, well, German by background, but he did his education in the US, and he worked for a long time for the World Bank and was often in Africa to help evaluate projects as to how the World Bank should be investing their money. Another thing to note is that the Trump administration, as the book says, is hesitant to support the World Bank, because you should also know that there has been a lot of criticism in recent years, in the last 2 decades, I'd say, 2.5 decades, that the World Bank is not necessarily useful. It's not spending money appropriately. It might be under some scandals and things. So there are some leaders, such as Trump, who think that maybe the US shouldn't be so involved with the World Bank. Also, because we're such a heavy contributor, maybe we're putting too much of our money in that direction while we need a lot of that money to resolve our things at home. So yeah, so the Trump administration is hesitant to support, but it will continue to be a member. Let's move on to the International Monetary Fund. So this is the sister organization. As I mentioned, it's across the street from the World Bank in Washington, D.C. It was created at the same time. The purpose is to stabilize the system of currency exchange and currency exchange rates and international payments to enable member countries to participate in global trade. So it lends foreign exchange to member countries. So similar, but it's not lending money for bridges and buildings and dams, etc. It's moderating and looking at a country's financial situation. So this is where I really like to think about Greece for sure, because in 2010, as I said, Greece was not doing well as an economy. And so the IMF came in and gave them some really nice loans, but they had very strict conditions on these loans, which is common with the IMF loans. They wanted the government to cut their spending. They wanted to devalue the currency. Some other things that the IMF might do is liberalize, financial outlets. And so sometimes the government has too much control over those financial outlets, and the IMF is there to help make them more free. And sometimes they want the government to reduce wages. So they did this in Greece, and it was a tough time for Greece in 2010 and the years following. Their unemployment jumped to 27% because the government spending was so drastically reduced. So a lot of people lost their jobs. Also pensions were slashed, and it became kind of not a fun place to be, I have to say. But if you've noticed, as I said, in the last 2 years, or last 6 months especially, that Greece has really opened up its borders to tourists, and that is a great way for them to create money and wealth in order to pay back some of these debts. So before 2010, the IMF was heavily involved, and Greece was not in a good place. But then there was a new government that came into power, and they are now improving and finding ways to have Greece make its own money and not have to depend on the IMF so much with their very strict rules and regulations. So IMF has started to pull out of Greece because they don't necessarily need their help, or hopefully won't need their help going forward. So let's move on to, here's another slide on the IMF. It imposes conditions on governments that receive its loans. These conditions often lead to hardship, as I mentioned with Greece, right? Demands that governments cut spending, devalue their currencies, increase exports, liberalize financial markets, and reduce wages. And they have a little illustration here. The IMF, it's like a tablet, I guess. You can just take one and it'll resolve your financial issues, I guess is what they're trying to say, in theory. Great, so the last organization is the WTO. This is a much more recent organization. This was founded in 1995, and it was the successor to this General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. This organization that again tried to moderate and helps regulations for trade, tariffs and trades globally. And this is an international body that establishes the ground rules for trade among nations. Its major objective is to promote free trade, attempts to eliminate barriers to trade. So it tries to stop any tariffs or duties between countries. It's sometimes not possible, but they try. It conducts rounds of negotiations on various topics, and the most favored nation rule means member countries cannot discriminate against foreign products for any reason. So why she put all that in here, the author of this textbook. Before I get into that, I just want to note that there's no lending here with the WTO. All they do is set regulations. And so she's saying that the WTO is set up to not discriminate against foreign products for any reason. And as you can see, the author is not a big fan of Trump, which that's okay, but both sides need to be heard. And in 2018, right, Trump imposed tariffs on China, including, she gave this example of solar panels, but it's many different products. So China has traditionally always had high tariffs on US products, but no one can seem to control China. But in reverse, we don't have many tariffs on Chinese products. And Trump was saying that we're losing a lot of competition for American products. This has come up in other chapters, right? And so he put tariffs on China, and that has been debated whether that was actually useful for American businesses or not. So you can read the side article in the textbook about solar panels, and if that was really a good thing that he did. But the Trump's goal was to kind of level the playing field, they say, with China, because China has had so much control because they have so many products coming into the US. And yeah, and so we wanted to make sure that American companies could compete with those products. That ends part 1 of chapter 4. Again, I'm Professor Green, and I look forward to seeing you in part 2.